Sometimes I come across information that just leaves me stunned. Did you know World War II wasn't all battles and heroes?
So join us today as we look at the brutal executions of the nurses of Banker Island.
There were some seriously dark moments, especially the brutal war crimes committed by the Japanese military.
A 3-day naval bombardment of the entire Lingayen Gulf area.
Things got so dark that it's even difficult for me to mention them. But, well, we gotta go down this rabbit hole as well. So hold tight because I am about to show you things you'll wish you never witnessed. Let's get started. Number 20. The unthinkable horror of survival. War often drives people to unspeakable extreme. And for some Japanese soldiers, the brutal conditions in places like Papua New Guinea and the Philippines led to one of the most shocking aspects of their survival tactics. Believe it or not, this tactic was cannibalism. As the war dragged on and supply lines were cut off, some soldiers resorted to consuming the bodies of their fallen comrades. When Japanese troops were starving and isolated on the island of New Guinea, they turned to eating the flesh of deceased soldiers, or even civilians. This was reported as a survival strategy by various soldiers and survivors of the conflict. The soldiers would sometimes boil parts of their victims, and the cannibalism got so out of hand that it was eventually investigated after the war. And the most sickening part is that rather than seeing it as a moral breakdown or a desperate act of survival, it was often brushed off, and in some cases, even encouraged to sustain the strength of the troops. But this isn't even close to as horrific as the crime I have for you at number 1, so make sure you stick around until the end. Number 19. The Rape of Nanking. In December 1937, after weeks of brutal fighting, Japanese forces finally captured the city of Nanking. This is a city in China, which is now known as Nanjing. What happened next is one of the most horrifying mass atrocities in modern history. It was an event that still sends shivers down the spine. The Japanese soldiers began a 6-week rampage through the city. They were inflamed by racist propaganda and the heat of war, and no, these men were not just about killing enemy combatants. They were terrorizing an entire population. Over 2 lakh people were brutally murdered, often with uttermost cruelty. Public executions were a daily occurrence, and bodies would pile up in the streets. One of the most sickening aspects of the massacre was the systematic rape of tens of thousands of women. The estimates range from 20,000 to 80,000 women who were assaulted in just a few weeks.
And the Japanese soldiers went door to door looking for girls, and many were immediately killed after their horrific ordeal.
And this didn't just happen to the soldiers committing the crimes either. Civilians, including children, were caught in the crossfire as well.
They also massacred 1,300 Chinese soldiers and civilians at the Taiping Gate, and many were blown up with landmines and then set on fire with petrol before being finished off with bayonets.
What's horrifying is that the Japanese military didn't even see this as a shameful act, but as a victory celebration. Soldiers were encouraged to commit atrocity. The horror was so widespread that even Japanese officers were appalled by the scope of the brutality. Yet, little to nothing was done to stop it. Number 18. The epitome of human cruelty. Never ever step inside the chilling world of Unit 731. I repeat, never ever. It is a unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that conducted some of the most horrific experiments ever performed on human beings. But this wasn't your average secret military operation. Unit 731 was a full-scale research unit focused on biological and chemical warfare. But the thing here is that instead of using animals for testing, they used live human beings. These human beings were often prisoners of war or civilians captured in China, Korea, and other occupied territory. These were not volunteers either. These were people forced into horrendous experiments. And the experiments were so cruel, it's hard to believe they actually happened. Prisoners were injected with deadly diseases like bubonic plague, cholera, and anthrax to study how the human body would react.
They were injected with bubonic plague, cholera, bombarded with intense radiation, amputations to study blood loss, and other horrific experiments.
Some people were exposed to extreme temperatures, like freezing cold or boiling heat, to test how far the body could be pushed before breaking down. One of the most infamous stories is that of a man who was deliberately infected with anthrax and then dissected alive. And it wasn't just the physical pain that these prisoners had endured. Their mental health was nowhere normal either.
After Japan surrendered, General Ishii ordered the destruction of Unit 731, which included more than 150 buildings, all the laboratories, and the 2 adjacent airports.
Number 17. The Bataan Death March. It was April 9th, 1942, and after months of fierce fighting in the Philippines, American and Filipino forces were finally forced to surrender to the Japanese. Around 75,000 soldiers were taken prisoner by the Japanese army, and most of them were exhausted, hungry, and wounded. And the next thing was was nothing short of a death sentence. The prisoners were forced to march over 60 miles from Mariveles, Bataan, to a prison camp in Capas. And this wasn't a leisurely stroll by any means. The conditions were horrendous. They were exposed to the scorching sun, denied water and food, and subjected to brutal violence. Anyone who would fall behind or stumble due to exhaustion or injuries was mercilessly beaten or shot. And if you thought things couldn't get worse, there were also reports of beheadings and decapitations for anyone who even looked like they might collapse or attempt to escape. And as if this wasn't enough, the march took place in the heat of the Philippine summer, where temperatures could easily reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of the men had no shoes, and many were already weakened by starvation, dysentery, and disease. The brutality of the Bataan Death March has been etched in the memories of those who survived and the families of those who didn't. And to make matters worse, when the survivors finally reached their destination, the horrors didn't end. Even then, many people were subjected to further abuse, starvation, and death in the prison camp. Number 16. The Suk Ching Massacre. When Singapore lost to the Japanese in 1942, the Imperial Army wasted no time in taking control of the region. The Suk Ching Massacre was a part of that. It was a purge of anyone that the Japanese thought was a threat to their rule. But this wasn't some strategic military operation. It was pure terror.
Yamashita, then commander of the Japanese 25th Army and his chief of staff, planned the Suk Ching operation against the Chinese in Singapore.
The Japanese military targeted Singapore's ethnic Chinese population. They accused them of being sympathetic to Chinese resistance movements and communism. From February to March 1942, thousands of Chinese civilians, including men, women, and even children, were assembled and screened. The screening was a cruel way to determine who would live and who would die. Those who were deemed undesirable were executed, often in the most brutal ways imaginable. They were beheaded, shot in the head, or bayoneted. Even women and children were not spared. Some stories also narrate that families were forced to watch as their loved ones were executed. By the time the massacre ended, estimates suggest that anywhere from 25 to 50,000 people had been killed. What makes the Suk Ching massacre particularly horrifying is that it was not an isolated event. It was a part of a wider campaign of terror aimed at controlling the population through fear. The Japanese military didn't see the people of Singapore as humans. They were just pawns in a game of domination. Number 15. The comfort women. This is one of the darkest and most uncomfortable parts of the war that has taken decades to fully come to light. The Japanese Imperial Army had set up a system known as the Comfort Station. It was a place where women were forced into sexual slavery. And these women were often young girls. These women were taken from occupied territories like Korea, China, and the Philippines, and were told they would be working as nurses or factory workers. Instead, they were raped, abused, and used by Japanese soldiers for the comfort of the troop. The women were known as comfort women. These women endured horrific physical and mental trauma. Not only that, they were often subjected to sexual violence multiple times a day.
Many women died in the brothels as a result of starvation, exploitation, and filthy living conditions.
The women were kept in filthy barracks and treated like nothing more than garbage. After the war, many of the women who survived faced further trauma, as their suffering was ignored or minimized by the Japanese government. While Japan has issued apologies over the years, the issue still remains highly controversial, with many survivors and their advocates demanding a formal apology. To this day, the legacy of the comfort women is a source of tension between Japan and its neighboring countries, particularly South Korea. Number 14. The mass executions of prisoners. During the early stages of Japan's military expansion, prisoners of war were treated with an unmatched level of cruelty. Contrary to the Geneva Convention, the Japanese army viewed prisoners not as soldiers to be held for future negotiation. Instead, they would think of them as expendable tools of war. Mass executions of these prisoners were common, and many of them were simply murdered in cold blood. One of the most well-known cases was the massacre of Allied prisoners of war on the island of Palawan in 1944.
The POW camps in Japan were a daunting example of a hell designed to never be escaped. Surrounded by high, unscalable wooden fencing and encased in barbed wire.
After the American forces had begun to recapture territory in the Philippines, the Japanese rounded up 150 American prisoners and forced them into a mass grave. Then, they set the grave on fire, burning the men alive. Only 11 of them survived. This event was just one example of the broader pattern of cruelty towards the prisoners of war. There were many more similar crimes. You name them. Number 13. The death of the USS Indianapolis crew. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis in July 1945 was one of the most tragic and horrifying naval events of World War II. The ship had just delivered the components of the atomic bomb to the U.S. military. and was on to another destination. Just then, it was struck by 2 torpedoes from a Japanese submarine. The ship sank in a matter of minutes, and around 900 men were cast into the ocean. But here's where the story turns even darker. Despite the ship sinking, the Japanese did not immediately come to the aid of the surviving crew members. Many of the men died from exposure, dehydration, or were attacked by sharks. The horror didn't stop even there. For several days, no help arrived, and the men were left to die in the water. The U.S. Navy didn't even know the ship was missing for days. By the time they were rescued, only 316 men had survived. Number 12, the shelling of Chongqing. Chongqing is located in southwestern China. It became the target of horrific air raids by the Japanese military during the Second Sino-Japanese War. This war was later merged with World War II. For over 4 years, the city was bombarded continuously. Japanese bombers would drop inflammable bombs on civilian areas, destroying homes, schools, hospitals, and cultural sites. The Japanese didn't care whether they were hitting military targets or civilian areas. The population of Chongqing was subjected to regular bombing. Over 11,000 people were killed, and thousands more were left homeless. This aerial terror campaign targeted civilians as part of Japan's broader strategy to break the will of the Chinese people.
Devastating incidents occurred on the 5th of June in 1941, when the Japanese flew more than 20 sorties, bombing the city for 5 hours.
In the end, it wasn't just the bombs that caused suffering. It was the psychological toll of living in constant fear. Number 11, the Burma Railway. The Thailand-Burma Railway was a project built by the Japanese using forced labor during World War II. It is often referred to as the Death Railway. Between 1942 and 1943, the Japanese enslaved more than 60,000 war prisoners and 80,000 Southeast Asian laborers to construct a railway connecting Thailand to Burma.
Alongside 60,000 Allied prisoners of war who worked upon it, up to 250,000 civilian workers were forced to create the railway.
The conditions of this railway project were absolutely horrendous, and it's said that over 16,000 prisoners and 1 LAC local workers died due to the brutal conditions. The laborers were forced to work for 18 hours a day with little rest, and anyone who fell behind or couldn't work was executed or left to die. Then, diseases like malaria, dysentery, and cholera swept through the work. The food was also almost non-existent. So, the story of the Burma Railway is a dark testament to the cruel, almost inhuman treatment the Japanese military inflicted on their prisoners and workers. Number 10, the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a nightmare when Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. It wasn't just a military strike. It was a violation of international law and human decency.
In 1937, the Japanese advanced on average 29 kilometers a day, but in 1939, this was reduced to less than 1.
In a surprise attack, Japan bombed the U.S. naval base in Hawaii. This attack killed over 2,400 Americans and wounded more than 1,000 people. The attack was intended to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and prevent America from interfering with Japan's plans to expand its empire in Asia and the Pacific. While this event itself was a military movement, the aftermath was far worse. It started a series of retaliatory action, including the internment of Japanese Americans in camps across the United States. But beyond that, the war that followed was filled with horrific atrocities. The attack on Pearl Harbor led directly to a global conflict where atrocities would be committed on both sides. It marked the beginning of a brutal conflict that changed the world forever. Number 9, the Manila Massacre. The Manila Massacre is one of the lesser-known, yet equally horrific war crimes committed by Japanese forces during the final months of World War II. In February 1945, the American forces closed in on the Philippines and recaptured Manila. Then, thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire. Women, children, and elderly people were targeted in brutal assaults. The Japanese soldiers used flamethrowers, bayonets, and machine guns to massacre civilians. Some of the atrocities were particularly cruel, like women were raped before being murdered, families were killed in front of each other, and entire neighborhoods were burned down. By the time the massacre ended, approximately 1 lakh civilians had lost their lives. The city of Manila was left in ruins, and the survivors of the massacre were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Number 8, the execution of female nurses. During the Japanese occupation of territories like the Philippines, China, and other parts of Southeast Asia, there was another terrifying practice that was very common. In this occupation, the female nurses found themselves in a particularly brutal position. These women were captured by the Japanese military, often during intense battles or after cities fell. Many of these women were working with the Allied forces or as a part of humanitarian mission. Instead of being treated as non-combatants, many of these nurses were executed on the spot, especially when the Japanese forces wanted to send a message of terror to the local population. One particularly barbaric example took place in the Philippines, when a number of American and Filipino nurses were rounded up by the Japanese after the Battle of Bataan. They were executed by shooting or bayoneting. What makes this atrocity stand out is the cold disregard for the role of nurses as medical professionals. They weren't considered prisoners of war, just plain targets. Number 7. Operation Cherry Blossoms. During World War II, Japan had a secret plan that could have unleashed horrors on the United States. It was known as Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. This operation involved plans to deploy biological weapons on American soil, specifically targeting civilians. The operation was conceived by the Japanese Imperial Army in 1944, and its aim was to use germ warfare to strike fear into the American public. The plan involved using bacteriological bombs to be dropped on U.S. cities. These bombs would carry pathogens like plague or anthrax. Japan had been developing these biological weapons as a part of its biological warfare program, and the attack was supposed to cause mass outbreaks of disease. The bombs would be launched from aircraft, and they would release deadly pathogens into the environment. The goal wasn't just to kill. In fact, Japan intended to create widespread panic and chaos, which would cripple the morale of the U.S. civilian. The plan was to target American cities in the Pacific, including San Diego, California. According to the Japanese, these biological agents would spread rapidly, infecting people in public spaces and causing death and panic throughout the population. Luckily, the operation never came to completion. The Japanese military was forced to abandon the plan as the war turned against them. Number 6. The attack on Darwin. In 1942, Japan extended its military campaign to the Australian mainland, specifically to the northern city of Darwin. This attack occurred on February 19th. It was one of the largest air raids ever carried out on Australian soil during World War II. Japanese bombers struck Darwin with the intention of crippling the Australian military and preventing it from supporting forces in the Pacific.
Overall, 253 people that we know about were killed. The Japanese, it was a very successful attack as far as they were concerned. They sank at least 4 principal vessels in Darwin Harbour.
The attack was brutal, and the city was left in flames. Hundreds of people were killed, and much of the city's infrastructure was destroyed. This raid was a critical moment in the Pacific War, because it showed that no place was truly safe from Japan's reach. The raid left lasting scars on the city of Darwin, and it's still remembered as one of the most brutal moments in Australia's wartime history. Number 5. Submarine warfare against civilians. In addition to their brutal land campaigns, the Japanese Navy also engaged in submarine warfare. They attacked merchant ships carrying civilians, food, and medical supplies. A tragic event took place in 1943 when the Japanese submarine 152 sank a British merchant ship, the SS St. Clair. This British ship was carrying civilians and refugees fleeing the war. The attack led to the deaths of over 400 people. This included women and children, showing the ruthlessness with which Japan waged its war. While submarine warfare is often associated with military targets, the Japanese frequently targeted civilian shipping routes. This caused untold suffering to those who had no part in the war. Number 4. The killing of American prisoners of war on Wake Island. Wake Island is a small coral atoll in the Pacific Ocean. It was the site of one of the most infamous mass executions of American prisoners of war during World War II. After the Japanese captured the island in December 1941, American soldiers and civilians were taken prisoner. For the most part, the prisoners were treated poorly, and as the war dragged on, conditions became increasingly desperate. But it wasn't just the starvation and disease that plagued the prisoners. It was the Japanese military's decision to execute them outright. In 1943, when American forces began pushing toward the Pacific Islands, the Japanese decided to kill the remaining American prisoners on Wake Island. Number 3. The atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese Navy. While much of the focus has been on the Army's war crimes, the Imperial Japanese Navy also played a role in committing brutal atrocities. One of the most notorious ones, the sinking of the USS Houston and the Perth in the Battle of the Java Sea in 1942. After these ships were sunk, surviving sailors were often subjected to horrific abuse. Many war prisoners were captured after the battle and subjected to physical and psychological torture. They were kept in shameful conditions, often starving and disease-ridden. They also had little to no access to medical treatment. Some of the prisoners were sent to work in labor camp, while others were killed straight away. The Japanese Navy's treatment of prisoners was just as callous as that of the Army, as in, no mercy was shown to captured soldiers. Number 2. Vivisection without anesthesia. One of the most horrifying and brutal atrocities committed by the Japanese during World War II involved vivisection. It was the dissection of living human beings, that too without anesthesia. It was a part of Unit 731's barbaric experiments. The victims were mostly Chinese civilians, and prisoners were subjected to these horrific surgeries while they were fully conscious, and there was no attempt to provide any kind of pain relief.
In many cases, guards would stuff a rag or gauze into the mouths of the victims to silence their screams, ensuring no sound would disrupt the researchers' concentration.
The experiments were part of a sickening attempt to study the effects of various diseases, chemical agents, and biological weapons on the human body. In many cases, the subjects would be injected with diseases such as the plague, anthrax, or cholera, and then they were dissected alive to observe the progression of the illness. Number 1. Frostbite experiments. The Japanese Army didn't just stop at vivisection. Frostbite experiments were another horrific form of experimentation. These experiments were designed to test how the human body would react to extreme cold. These experiments were carried out by Unit 731 in Manchuria, where prisoners were subjected to freezing temperatures to study the effects of frostbite, gangrene, and other cold-induced injury.
Researchers also experimented with various defrosting methods, rapid rewarming, gradual rewarming, and worst, using open flames causing severe burns.
The process was gruesome, to say the least. Prisoners were often tied to posts or restrained in some way. Then, they were exposed to sub-zero temperatures for hours on end. Their limbs would slowly freeze, and the soldiers conducting the experiments would then rewarm the frozen limbs, only to freeze them again. Moreover, numerous victims were subjected to these experiments, and the data gathered was used to develop tactics for the battlefield. And the fact that these atrocities were carried out in the name of military research is truly shocking and cruel.